I'm Amy Harrington, and I'm conducting an interview with Al Jean on behalf of the Archive of American Television on March 13th, 2013, in Los Angeles, California. Okay.
All right, we have liftoff.
So we're going to start with just getting like 10 minutes worth of background information.
Okay.
So what was your name at birth?
Alfred Ernest Jean III, but I go by Al because it is a terrible name.
Fair enough. When and where were you born?
I was born in Detroit, Michigan, January 9th, 1961, same birthday as Richard Nixon.
And is that where you grew up?
I grew up in Farmington Hills, which is a suburb of Detroit. Eminem's from 8 Mile, I'm from 12 Mile. And growing up, I worked at, my family had a hardware store. So that was the formative experience of my life was trying to avoid working in the hardware store. That's what drove me to TV.
So did your dad run the hardware store?
Yeah.
And what was his name?
His name was Al Jean Jr. And the store was located right next to my house, so basically, like, you could be called at any time from whatever you were doing into the hardware. And my sole goal was to have something like, better to do, so I wasn't at home.
And did the whole family work there? Did your dad found it, or?
My grandfather founded it, Al Jean Sr. And everybody in my family worked there at one time or another. It's still there. My aunt runs it now.
And what about your mother? What's her name? And did she work there as well?
My mother is named Myrna Jean, ironically. And she was a teacher when she met my dad, a Catholic school teacher. And then I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters. So, when she started having kids, that was her job.
What are their names, your brother and sister?
They're all younger than me, Mary, Don, Lisa, and Marty.
What traits do you think you inherited from your parents?
Well, my dad's an extremely hard worker. I would, see him get up and even earlier than he'd had to go to open the store, he would go pick up salt from, the salt delivery place. And the store would open at 8 and close at 8, and he'd work all that time, 7 days a week. And my mother, as a teacher, she was, an avid reader, always has been an avid reader, and encouraged me to read and write, and was anything that I do, writing wise, I think comes from her.
Was there humor in your household?
There was some. My sister actually was the really funny one. She, of say the Simpsons, my sister would be Bart, and I was more like Lisa Simpson, where I was just kind of quiet and reading while my sister would be saying instead of Grace, rub it up dub, time for the grub, and my dad would get mad. He wouldn't strangle her because she was a girl, but it got into some pretty heated arguments. That's
funny. What were your interests growing up?
Well, as a kid I liked baseball, and when I was in high school I got into science and math. I went to math camp for 2 summers, which I guess is an invaluable experience for a comedy writer. there were pretty much only men at the math camp, and it was it was the nerdiest thing you could possibly imagine doing, I would say. When I was 16, I graduated from high school. I went to Harvard, and my freshman year, I met Mike Reese, who was my writing partner for 20 years. And we both liked the Beatles, what an amazing coincidence. And we became friends, and he wanted to get on the Harvard Lampoon humor magazine. He had heard of it, and he was always intent on being a comedy writer. So he got on, and when he joined, the people I met through him were the funniest people in the world. I just, thought this would be great to be with this group of people. So I joined after, and I still work with many of them, including Mike.
It's amazing. When you were little, was working on a TV show at all one of your goals? What did you want to be?
In high school, I read a lot of literature, and I sort of thought it would be cool to be a writer, but I was pre-med until I realized I wasn't great around sick people, and I hated the other pre-meds. They were just the most grade-grubbing, nasty group of people. So I was kind of floundering for something to do, and then when we were in college, we wrote an article that Ted Mann, who's now the creator of the Hatfields and the McCoys, who's an editor there, liked, and they offered us a job at National Lampoon. So that was really the one job I got offered. out of college. The only other thing I could have taken is I knew some guys that went to work for this place called Microsoft. I don't know how that turned out. So National Lampoon was the startup for me, and that's where I went.
When you were young, did you watch a lot of TV?
You know, some. Everybody watched TV, but there were shows like Get Smart where my mother wouldn't let me watch it when I was young. She thought it was too violent, and then they would kill people and make jokes about it. So a lot of my experience with television and movies would come after I went to college, like catching up on things.
And what shows did you get into when you did start watching?
Well, one show I do remember watching with my family that we all loved was Mary Tyler Moore. We thought that was the funniest thing in the world. And I never, to answer the earlier question, never would have conceived of being a writer for one of those shows. I just thought they were the funniest things in the world. And I don't even know if I thought they had writers, but I certainly would have never imagined I could have done that. And then much less have worked with some of the people that did those shows was astounding to me, is astounding to me. I never get over it.
And talk a little bit, you mentioned Mike, talk about how you met and how your writing partnership actually started.
Well, what happened was I had written an article for the Harvard Lampoon, a period of Encyclopedia Brown, those little mysteries you would get when you were a kid, and the clue was always something like a calendar dated February 31st, or somebody talking about the first Battle of Bull Run, and how would they know there was going to be a second, So I made fun of that, and National Lampoon, Ted Mann liked that article, so Mike said, why don't we do an article for them called a 3-minute mystery parody. It was a similar thing. They hired us both as editors. We wrote some things together. We wrote an article. There was a series of articles in magazines where different people like Kurt Vonnegut would tell you how to write fiction. So we thought it would be funny to have Thurgood Marshall, the Supreme Court Justice, tell you how to write pornography. He would say that the porno that a Supreme Court Justice would read was very boring, and he would talk about how to lighten it up. And in his porno, he was always a character, and he was very well endowed. And people really liked it, but we found out years later that he didn't like it, and he actually had given it to the FBI to see if they could do something about the writers of the article. And I thought, wait, this is the Supreme Court judge who should be for free speech, and he's coming after us. But I only found this out long after he passed away.
Wow. So how did your work at the National Lampoon lead to your first job in television?
It was that article. It was a combination of two things. There were these writers that we had known in the Harvard Lampoon, Max Pross and Tom Gamble. And they're hilarious guys, a little older. When they got out of college, they went to work for Saturday Night Live. And that was the first time I thought that anybody like me could work for a television show. I mean, I just was amazed that they were there, and that was during the first 5 seasons that they were there, and it was the coolest thing in the world. And they met this guy, Ken Finkelman, who was directing Airplane 2, and he was looking for rewrite guys to help him with the rewrite, and they were unavailable, so they recommended us. And we sent him the Thurgood Marshall article, and unlike Thurgood, he enjoyed it and hired us. And we came out to work on the movie, and we were week to week for 18 weeks. And we moved out of New York. We quit our job, and said, we're leaving now. The plane's leaving. Goodbye. Sorry. We came out here, and I stayed in LA ever since. That was in 1982.
And what was your first TV script?
We wrote, once Airplane 2 ended, we also had a movie script that we wrote with Finkelman, but he wanted a script that was a black comedy, like MASH, set in the Vietnam War, and we opened it with a bar mitzvah being held in the middle of a battle that the colonel wanted his son, it was like a Vietnam bar mitzvah would be a fun thing. And people liked the script, but they thought it would never be, something they would shoot. And so we started writing spec scripts, and we wrote a couple of spec cheers. But the thing that got us work was actually that feature script. It was read by James Comack, who created Welcome Back, Kotter, and he was running the show 9 to 5 at the time. And so we were story editors on 9 to 5 briefly with him. And it also got us work on Not Necessarily the News, which was run by John Moffat and Pat Lee. And 9 to 5 didn't last long, but Not Necessarily the News did. It was a really funny show, and they did some great things with real footage of Reagan. There was one, I remember, we didn't write this, but it was Reagan leading people into a building where there were these flash bulbs going, but it looked like a haunted house, and they put horror music under it, and then they'd put screams as he pushed somebody inside. And it was a really funny show. It was a great place to work.
I want to talk about that in a sec. Did the spec scripts lead you to get an agent, or was it when you were on 9 to 5 that you got? When did that happen? We
went the totally backward process. We got an agent because we had a job working on an airplane movie and another script. So, yeah, to me, getting an agent and joining the Writers Guild was like, well, you know, of course, you do it. Like, it's not difficult. We were very spoiled, and. There was a brief interregnum where, you know, we were out of work and I applied to business school, and Finkelman was going to be, you've been out of work for 3 months, like, you should suffer some. It's like, he was right. Then when we had an agent, we got another opportunity to submit to the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, and we did, and we met with Carson. They said, you have to go to a personal interview. And we said, well, what does he ask? And they said, we don't know, but some people don't make it, you know. So we were like, well, why didn't somebody make it? And somebody said, well, there's a guy who was too fat. Like, I better not look too fat. And we went in and talked to him for about 5 minutes. And it was like being on the show. You just kind of got interviewed, and he said, okay. And then we worked there for a year and a half.
Do you remember the kinds of questions he asked you during the interview?
He just made jokes about it. We didn't talk much. He made jokes about us being young and about, you know, just, you know, what would we like on the show? And it was very, very brief. I worked there for a year and a half, and I even did an interview on a documentary about him, but the interview lasted longer than my time with him, actually. I only was there, you know, in his presence for about 30 minutes, I would say.
We'll circle back around to that, too. When you were in the 9 to 5 period and you were writing for sitcoms, you wrote for like Charles in Charge and a couple other shows. Were you finding it easy to get those kind of one-off scripts? Or?
Well, like the Charles in Charge is a good example where our agent was saying we should try to get into more conventional shows. So we pitched to them. And the episode with our credit on it has one line by us. There was a kid in a wizard suit, and I pitched him saying, I'm going to leave for 1,000 years. And then they pitched him saying, okay, come back with milk. And so that's my Charles in Charge credit. We wrote Ahead of the Class, where we had them play volleyball, and we had one of the kids get hit in the head. I think he's now a producer of a Disney Channel show, so I hope he's not mad. And, you know, really the next full-time thing that we got, we were kind of pigeonholed in the 80s as, you know, writers of goofy things because we'd come off, you know, an airplane movie, and because not necessarily the news was a sketch show. So the first full-time sitcom job we got after 9 to 5 was on Sledgehammer, which was a satirical show loosely based on the Dirty Harry movies, with his really, really funny actor, David Rashi, who you've seen in a lot of things.
And was that the sitcom-y kind of goofy humor, or the sledgehammer-y humor, which was kind of more your personal style?
Well, it's funny because you see me in this interview, you know, the reputation we had is those are the craziest, looniest people. If you bring them into a normal sitcom and hell's going to break loose. So, you know, we were always going on these shows, but you know, it's the same thing. You're just trying to write jokes. And with Sledgehammer, what was difficult was the pilot was very expensive for that time. And, you know, shooting a Dirty Harry movie on a TV budget is not easy. So when they would get to the scripts that my partner and I would write, they'd go, okay, your script has to take place in one room. Like, what kind of a cop adventure takes place in a room? So we did a thing where the room was besieged and barricaded by a guy who got in and locked them in, you know. It was, you know, my experience and how the money of television interferes with the with the comedy. You know, like there's never one is never out of your mind as you're producing a TV show.
Well, it must be liberating then to do an animated series where that's...
You would think, but even in animation, the biggest monetary constraint is the number of retakes you do. You know, you're constantly writing stuff, and you can certainly write anything and go anywhere. But when you come to the, say, color print and you want to change stuff, it costs several $1,000s to change a minute of animation, and we have an $80,000 total retake budget. So, yeah, money's always the ceiling. More, I would say that these days than language or standards, it's money. Just making sure that you hit the budget, which is always something I've been, extremely conscious of. I treat it like it's my own.
Yeah. Back in the Sledgehammer-ish days, you were a story editor. So explain that title and what the role of a story editor is on a TV show.
I have no idea. What happened was there used to be this process. Well, as I understood it, back in the 70s, somebody would be the producer, Norman Lear, and people would come in as freelancers and say, I want to do a show where Archie Bunkert does an editorial reply. And Norman Lear would go, great, write that script, and then he would rewrite it with a couple of people. As staffs grew, there was a hierarchy which would be like story editor, then executive story editor, until finally you got to be a producer, which was a different level, and it was a big deal. We were on ALF for a year, and one reason we left is because they wouldn't make us producers. And now, on The Simpsons, which has been on for 25 years, everyone's a co-executive producer or better because you just keep rising up this level. And, the studio will always go, well, you can promote somebody. It's easier than giving them more money. So I really, I can't quite explain the difference in a lot of things. I mean, since I've been in TV, the term showrunner has gotten into vogue, and that that definitely implies the person who's in charge of the day-to-day operations, and certainly the person who gets blamed if anything goes wrong. So, I know what that is, but producer titles, and they can mean they can mean someone who started a show and left. They can mean someone who's in charge of the budget. They can mean a writer who's been there a long time. It's really hard to say.
Talk a little bit about your working relationship with Mike in the early days and how you wrote together, what that process was like.
Well, I did. First of all, just to say he's a terrifically funny guy and brilliant. I still work with him one day a week on The Simpsons. He comes in, and there are different ways that two writers will work together. Sometimes somebody will be the story person, someone will be the joke person. Now, people will email scripts back and forth from one to the other. We sat there with one pad of paper that either of us would hold and went through everything line by line, and then we would go over it. And so every phase of it we would do together. And when we were running The Simpsons in seasons 3 and 4, we actually did all phases of the process together, all the editing, and we were working literally 20-hour days at one point. And now I go, wait, why didn't I let him do the editing while I directed the act? I mean, it made no sense. But we were so terrified of anything, when The Simpsons hit, and it was, the first showrunner was Sam Simon, who taught us how to do it. And, it was a Jim Brooks show, which was the gold standard for me. And I was such a big fan of Matt's work that we just didn't want anything to slip. And I still don't, but, we were just crazed at that point about, every single thing.
Yeah, understandably, when you're new to it.
Yeah, no, I was. Well, we weren't even sure we wanted to run the show. It was Sam had run it, and he was going to do other stuff with Jim, and so they kind of said, okay, now you run the next one, and then the next one, and now you're running. and I was, this was at the time just the biggest thing in the world. Certainly, it was a little bit like, to me, my Beatlemania. It was that popular. You could walk down the street, people would be talking about The Simpsons. And my biggest fear, I would wake up every Monday morning, going, oh, God, don't let me ruin it, And it's gone in 25 years, so that's something.
Yeah, I think you're doing all right.
Thank you. Go online and say that, please.
Okay, sure. No problem. So let's circle back to not necessarily the news. At what point during the run of that show did you guys get involved? Do you remember?
It had already been on the air, and like a lot of things that we'd worked on, they sent us tape, and I thought it was hilarious. Basically, that was way before YouTube. They had a file of footage from, I think it was called the Grinberg Library. So it was basically they would just have everything Reagan did that was on camera. And we would sit there. The head writer was Matt Newman. There were writers Arnstein and Hurwitz, Elaine Pope, a lot of really funny people. You just watch this footage, and then I remember one I watched where Lech Walesa was in this van and he had some kind of plant that his woman gave him, and I thought, oh, it looks like Cheech and Chong. So we did a matching shot of the van, like bouncing up and down like he was having sex, and put Low Rider, and it just turned into a Cheech and Chong promo. And that was it. It was just free association, looking at footage and thinking of ideas. There were also things that were just sketches that didn't use footage, but mostly it would come from that. And it was a really fun job. It was, the only drawback was it was not full-time. They would go on for about 10 weeks and then off. And after us, Conan O'Brien and Greg Daniels were a team that was hired to replace us. And because it went off for 10 weeks, Conan, I think they both got jobs at a place called Wilson's House of Suede and Leather. So you could have seen the two of the most successful men in show business selling you a leather suit back in 1986.
That's awesome. What was the atmosphere like in the writer's room on that show?
Well, it was very loose. It wasn't a technical rewrite room. Matt Newman was the guy in charge, and you would write basically... we were pretty prolific and tried, there were two of us, we tried to get as much stuff in as possible. So we'd write a bunch, and then they would have a meeting, Matt and Moffat and Lee, and then go through all the sketches and decide which ones they would shoot. John would direct. So there'd be meetings occasionally about what we want to, cover, but there was no formal, it was like working at a magazine. There was no formal rewrite or, not that kind of like, oh, you're with everybody all the time, the way you are in a sitcom.
Right. And did you just pull footage from that archive, or did you cover breaking news?
Well, there was a bit of a lag, and we would try to do stuff. For some reason, it wasn't formal, but we were on the Michael Jackson beat. So, like when his hair went on fire, we talked about using his hair as a fire starter, and you could rub a charcoal log on it, and it would burst into flames. And but it was never of the minute. It would be something that would air a few weeks later. And
were there subjects that were taboo that you couldn't dive into?
No, it was pretty, Reagan was the president, and I would say most of the writers were left-wing, but the thing about Reagan is, even when you were making fun of him, he's such an engaging-looking guy. Like, you didn't really hate him. You would just, like, be more amused by what he was doing. It was very hard to make him into a villain. It was it was much easier to make him into a comedy actor.
Right. And were there other skits? You mentioned that one, but were there other bits that you wrote that particularly stand out as favorites to you?
We did one. It's not like the most brilliant thing in the world. Stuart Pankin was an actor on the show, heavyset at that time. So we did a thing about Nadia Comaneci, because people kept saying how she had just lost it and she wasn't any good. So we did him dress up in a leotard and put a wig on and said, well, now look, this is unbelievable. And we just had him fall on a balance beam and split it in two. It was very funny, but I can't say it was the cleverest idea in the world.
Sounds good. And when and why did you leave that show?
Well, it was funny. I loved that job, and it was great. Every agent we had at the time kept saying, it's a nice job, but it's not going to lead to a big future for you in television. What you want to do is to get into producing half hours. And as I said, there was this feeling with us people had that we were these crazy men that would, get into the rewrite room of Growing Pains and turn them all into aliens or something. So our next job after Sledgehammer was Alf, which again was a kind of an offbeat show. The showrunner on that show, Bob Benditson, is a real formative guy in our careers. He was just really great manager, very funny. So, what I learned from how to organize a show and run a show that was successful was number 10, honestly, the second year, the year we were there. I learned from Bob.
Wow. Talk a little bit about Alf. Were there special things you had to consider when you were writing?
Alf was filled with restrictions. That was part of the reason it was really huge. The highest rated thing I ever wrote, unless maybe it was a Super Bowl episode of The Simpsons that was produced, but probably was Alf. Like the second season of Alf, it was number 10 in the ratings, and it had, I think, 24 million viewers or something enormous. And the restrictions, though, were although you saw in the credits a little person in a suit running around, that almost never happened. It was Paul Fusco, the puppeteer, manipulating the puppet. So they had to open a trench underneath the actors where he would be standing so that Alf could be on the same level as the actors. And every scene you would have to open a new trench for Alf to get into and close the previous trench. And I found out long after the actors were really getting terrified of falling into one of these trenches because, you know, you'd have to do the scene and not act like it was there. But if you fell, it would probably be a bad injury. And then there was a rule that they had that no one except his family could see Alf. So, you know, one person pitched a blind person, you know, another person pitched... you know, there was like one kid that could see him, but he, you know, nobody believed him. And like, you run out of people pretty quickly that Alf can see and talk to. So when we were there for a year, again, our agents kept saying, well, you know, there's a interest in you from the Gary Shandling show. We had written the one spec sitcom we wrote that got us a lot of interest was we wrote a spec Golden Girls, and our premise was that Dorothy had an accident with Mother Teresa when Mother Teresa was driving around in Florida, and that everybody called Dorothy a nun basher, and they were really mean to her. And then Mother Teresa actually admitted she didn't know they had right turn on red in Florida. And so we, you know, sent it to the Golden Girls, and they hated it. I never got any response from them, but Gary Shandling thought it was really funny. Most of the jobs that we got, I think, you know, from that point were off that spec. And Shandling... he was doing his show, but he didn't hire us as writers there. He did hire us to write jokes for him when he worked on The Tonight Show. He and Leno at one point were the only two guest hosts. And after 2 years of that, we got an offer to go to The Shandling Show, which was what our agent said, this is going to be the best credit you've ever had. It'll, you know, it's a really cool show. And it was the first time we won like Ace Awards for it. And Gary, you know, he's a really, really funny guy. I thought it was a hilarious show before I ever had anything to do with it.
So did you meet him for the first time when you were on The Tonight Show?
When I was applying for his show is when I met him. And it was a typical way that you would deal with Gary is like, we met him, we wrote the stuff, and the agent said, Gary loves you. And we were like, so we'll go on his show? No. But you can write jokes for him for The Tonight. I mean, he paid us, but... And then, you know, we go, oh, Gary loved those jokes. And we go, but he only used one. No, he really loved the one he used. So we're going to go on a show. No, he's going to ask you to write more jokes for The Tonight Show. So this happened for about 2 years. And then, you know, finally they said, oh, come on board. Gamble and Pross, who I mentioned earlier, were already there. And so we started in the 3rd and 4th seasons. And then we wrote about 5 episodes for those each season, for those 2 seasons.
Before we get to that, so... You worked on The Tonight Show staff.
I was a writer on The Tonight Show between 1984 and 1986.
And when were you writing the Gary Shandling jokes that were on The Tonight Show?
After we left. When I was on The Tonight Show, Joan Rivers was the only host. It was before the break between her and Johnny. Although I never met her until just recently when she did The Simpsons. We'd write jokes for her, but we would... Again, The Tonight Show was such a... That's the word for it. I never met half the other writers. I barely met Johnny. I never met Joan. I mean, you were just sort of like working in a little cubicle. I was in Burbank in this NBC office, and after 3 months, I said, "Hey, there's a mountain outside the window." I mean, it's like it was very, very like isolated experience.
So talk about that. So you and Mike would write jokes together.
Yes, we would write for Carson. There would be the head writer was Raymond Siller, and there would be topics that we would get. Like when, you know, the funny thing is people love Karnak, but Johnny hated doing Karnak. But we heard, again, everything I say about Johnny is only secondhand. I never heard him say things directly. But we heard he said, oh, it's just an easy day for the writers. I don't like it. We wrote a Karnak where, it was St. Elsewhere, and it's what's the message on Mother Teresa's answering machine. Did a lot of Mother Teresa jokes in the 80s. It was a fertile target. There was a story I can tell about being there. There was one magical word that always got a laugh, and that word was McNugget. And no matter what context it was in, the audience would nearly go crazy. So there was a skit where they were talking about celebrities endorsing products. So we thought, oh, what if, this is when Joan Collins was on Dynasty. We said, what if Joan Collins has a product for McDonald's, Bitch McNuggets? So I pitched that to Mike, and he looks at me like, well, that really doesn't make any sense whatsoever. I said, it's got McNugget in it, put it in. So the head writer came to us and he looked at it and he goes, I don't really understand this bitch McNugget joke, but I'm going to give it to Johnny. So he saw Johnny on the stage with the audience looking at it like, this makes no sense. And he read it and it got like a standing ovation. And you can see him going, what? Why did that happen? So when you're ever in need of a laugh, McNugget, yeah.
Do you remember the first time that Johnny delivered one of your jokes on the air?
I don't. I have tapes of all the times that we wrote for him, but I'm sure they're blurred. There was one time he thanked the writers, which we had done a bit, which was great. One thing I do remember is when he would do his anniversary show, he would ask the writers to perform at the after-show party. So we had to think of something to do, and I played piano a little bit. And so we came out, and Mike had all these balloons taped to him, and he was smoking a cigar. And as I played, he popped the balloons, kind of a stripper thing, but he had a T-shirt and shorts. And then the T-shirt said, I Heart Johnny. And so that went over well enough. And so then Johnny goes, at the mic, he goes, keep your day job, boys. And it's like, well, wait, you asked us to do it. And then our day job was working for him, and then we got let go 3 weeks later. So there were a lot of ironies. The only time I've ever been let go from a show.
Do you know why you were let go?
No, and it was strange because our theory is they would cycle through writers. Pat McCormick was fired 5 times. They actually called us a month later and said, can you come back? Now Johnny's in a good mood or whatever. And we'd already gotten hired on another show, so we couldn't go back. So it was all kind of mysterious.
And so now you said you wrote for Johnny, you wrote for Joan. Did you ever write for Jay?
Nope.
No. And then you wrote for jokes for Gary, but not when he was hosting.
We did write monologue jokes for Gary when he was hosting the show. Yeah.
Okay. And how did you approach writing for each of those people differently, or did you come at it from the same way?
Well, Johnny probably correctly had a very narrow frame of reference. He thought the audience could accept, like the most obscure sort of politician you could make fun of would be Tip O'Neill. The problem was there was a rhythm where, you do things like about baseball players scratching themselves or, rabbis performing circumcision, and that would be what would get laughs, so you'd start using them, and he'd say, I'm sick of doing that. But if you didn't give him that, he'd go, what you're giving me is too weird, they're not getting it, so then you get to go back to the same thing. So it was a little bit of a vicious circle. And there was a one thing that nobody I configured like doing called the edge of wetness. And like I'm trying to determine why we ever did it, because Johnny hated it, we hated it. Like, why did this thing keep coming out?
Habit, I guess.
I don't know.
And did you have any clue along the way kind of who was the heir apparent? And
No, we were not at that level at all. I mean, when we were there, I assumed Joan, and then that, rift happened. And then the only thing I thought when I was writing for Gary, he's very funny, but he kept saying, I don't want to be the host of The Tonight Show. I just am not. He would much rather do a satirical show like he did about a talk show than do a live interview show every night. It's just, he's more, he wants to have sort of control of his fictional universe, I would say.
And then when you were on ALF, there was a very special 2-part crossover episode.
Yeah, there was a crossover where they had ALF being the host. So they called us and they said, hey, do you have any jokes that you didn't use that you can sell? So we just came back. And that's actually where we used the St. Elsewhere joke. Johnny didn't use it, but we used it on the ALF. So nothing ever goes fallow. You're always recycling in comedy.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about It's Garry Shandling Show.
Sure.
So, so you said it was a couple of years into the series when you were
We started
hired?
at the beginning of season 3. It was an episode, I forget the title of it, but it was with Kurt Rambis in it. And that was, I would say to that point, the most difficult job I'd worked at, rewarding career-wise, and, really, really funny people like Gary and Tom and Max and Ellen Zoe Bell. But the way that show ran, I think that Gary, who again is one of the 5 funniest people I ever met, would have difficulty deciding on what he wanted to do. And so we would go back and forth during pre-production and really not settle on anything. And he much preferred just kind of like improvising and doing things on the fly. So you would work a lot of really late nights because you would suddenly change the premise of something. Like almost every script would be read and then completely thrown out. Even if it got, like we had one where Gary had pitched the idea to us. He said, I failed my driver's test and I think I'm stupid. And it read really funny, but he goes, yeah, I don't like the way we're doing it. So it was rewritten that he talked to his brain, and his brain again was Stuart Pankin, really chubby, out of shape guy. And then by the end, it was a real muscly guy. And it was really funny, and it was totally different from the original draft we had written. And that was that show. You know, it was, you were spending, you know, late nights, and it wasn't full time. It was, you know, half the year, but each week, you know, each show that we did, it was like, you know, say taking another island, you know, in the World War II for the U.S. Army.
Right. For people who might not have seen it, can you describe the premise of the show?
It was very, I think, revolutionary for the 80s. And it was, you know, in this time when there were very conventional sitcoms, Gary was aware that he was the star of a sitcom and had a funny theme. It was basically, you know, this is the theme to Gary's show, the opening theme to Gary's show. And then, you know, this is the part where I start to whistle and the singer would whistle. And Gary would know that, you know, everybody was a character and that, you know, he could speed up time. But again, it was like when you got there would be rules about what you could do and not do. And I'd be very confused. Like we'd have, you know, like a Brady Bunch thing. And they go, no, we wouldn't do that. We were going to have a flashback hat. That's what we'll do. And I go, but wait, which is crazier? Right? So, you know, but it was funny. I mean, and it was, you know, a great job to have worked on. And there's no question we didn't work with Sam Simon there. He was right before us, but I'm sure we wouldn't have gotten on The Simpsons had we not worked at the Shandling Show.
In what way?
Well, Sam worked there and knew it was a great show and that we were there for 2 years. And if, you know, someone had been there for 2 years, Sam would have, you know, Sam believed we had, you know, a lot of talent, and they were looking for Simpson writers. And again, they were looking for Gamble and Pross, but they were already committed to another show. So, it went to us. We were hired for 2 days a week to work on The Simpsons, and our agents weren't sure we should do it because it was pretty low money, but we thought, I thought Life in Hell was really funny, and to work with Sam, who I'd known but not worked with, and especially for Jim Brooks, who I thought did the best television of all, I was, you know, going, I don't know, you know, who knows if the show was going to be a hit, but I thought it was going to be very special, and I thought that it would get a lot of attention. When I was a kid, there was no animation on television, and a new animated show like Wait Till Your Father Gets Home was a big deal. So I thought, here, this Simpsons is coming on. It's going to get a lot of attention, and it's by these great people. So, yeah, why not try it?
When you were on the Gary Shandling Show, Arts Gary Shandling Show, you were a producer. Did you have responsibilities outside of writing on that show?
Pretty minor. Sometimes we would go to the stage and you know, observe, but generally what we did was they would have modules rewriting different portions of the script all the time. So they'd go, okay, you guys take this scene and just rewrite it and do this, and you guys take that scene and rewrite it. Usually Tom and Max would work with Alan Zoibel, and Mike and I would either be by ourselves or maybe with Gary, but Gary was often rehearsing. So we were just writing whatever they asked us to write, and also trying to think of ideas for the show, which was hard because Gary would go, I don't think that would happen to me. So one of the writers, Max Pross, said, what we should do if we want to pitch an idea is make it happen to Gary in real life, and then you can pitch it to him. Because like, oh yeah, that's true.
Did you actually do that?
Not quite, no.
Almost?
But we definitely, we knew everything about his life by the end of the time that we were on that show. Because
he shared it, or because you kind of...
He shared it. He, you know, he's very open, you know, about his life, and he's had some very sad things happen. But, you know, turned it into just being extremely funny. He nearly died in an auto accident, and that's why he stopped being a writer and wanted to become a performer. You know, so there was a lot of very interesting stuff that made him who he is.
Yeah.
And again, very, very funny.
Oh, yeah. The show was conceived to compete with not necessarily the news. Was that something you were conscious of when you were working on?
No idea. It was just, it was a Showtime show. And at the time, HBO, even still, HBO was the big, powerful cable network, and Showtime was, you know, it was such a big deal for them because they had this show that people were calling the best show. I had nothing to do with it at this point. At the beginning, they said this is the best show on television and it's on Showtime. But television-wise, what happened that was kind of sad was it was hard to see because a lot of people didn't have Showtime, so they sold it to Fox and then edited it, and it went on Fox, and it really wasn't the same show, and it got the lowest rating of any show on the air. So I think that really killed the syndication sale of the show, which would have been pretty high because it was something that was so prestigious until suddenly they said, oh, it's a last place show. Like the shine went off the diamond a little bit. But I'm really proud to have worked on it. I think it was really, last time I looked at the old DVDs and we did a commentary with Gary, it was really funny. And we were making fun of the clothes Gary was wearing. The one thing that was hilarious was we did a show, it was Gary's idea where he's in a celebrity golf tournament hosted by Martin Mull, and he hits the poster boy on the head with a golf ball. So he's really depressed because everybody hates him. And at the end of the show, Gary was so depressed, he's sitting in his bathrobe. So the poster boy comes with a priest, and it's a couch with Gary in a robe and a priest and a little boy. And I'm saying to Gary, when was this ever innocent? Like, you couldn't air this now without, like, this horrible double meaning. But it was the 80s. It was all cool.
You also wrote the final episode of the series.
We did, although it wasn't supposed to be the final. What happened was that Gary and Ellen Zabel had written a final episode where Gary died, I think was the premise, and for whatever reason it didn't come out the way that they wanted it to, and we had written a Driving Miss Daisy parody where Gary, for some reason, I don't know, Gary is heterosexual, but we would keep doing things where we'd make him like an old woman in the way he behaved. So he was Miss Daisy, basically. So we did this episode that we did, this Driving Miss Daisy parody, got moved into the end spot of the series, and they tacked in a little tag with him driving around in his little golf cart. But it was ironic because very late, not till very late in the whole process was it conceived as the finale.
What was the reaction to it as the finale, considering that?
People said, why was that the finale? And I don't have a good answer. I mean, this is, by the way, before the idea of doing a 400th episode or a finale or, was much less a big deal then. I can't remember, The Simpsons 100th was kind of a big deal and Cheers 200th, but you didn't have these milestones, and like The Fugitive, that had a finale because they had a whole point that they were going towards. But it's totally changed now. Everybody's going, oh, we've got to do a finale that's as good as Mary Tyler Moore. And, it's weird because a lot of shows are cyclical. They don't, something like The Sopranos, I love that finale because there is a big question you've got going into it. But comedies, I don't know if they always lend themselves as well. 30 Rock was a good finale.
Yeah, definitely. Do you have a favorite episode of It's Garry Shandling Show?
I think the one I would choose is the epitome of the show. It was written by Gamble and Pross, maybe Zweibel as well. Was one where he went to Hollywood, and he was Grant, the little kid, was in love with this girl named Lily Wu, and they took the Hollywood sign and they changed it to spell Lily Wu, and they sang "Hooray for Lily Wu," and Florence Henderson was in it, and it was just this brilliant episode. I can tell you another joke that's always been my favorite was somebody was looking for this character Pete's wife, Jackie Schumacher, and then they said, oh, that's right, you didn't know her, you knew her in college when she wasn't married. What was her maiden name? Schumacher. Oh yes, Jackie Schumacher, I know her quite well. That kind of joke. Oh, and there's another joke that I thought was like really funny, everybody loved, was where Gary's at a party and he gets drunk or something, and he takes off his clothes, and he has a big black dot around his groin, like that you would have in a TV censorship. They actually built the dot. It was really funny.
Do you have fans of the show ever tell you what their favorite episodes are?
What I find, if I say I worked in that show, first they go, oh, Larry Sanders, and I go, no. And then they go, oh, the other one, that was great. But I don't know whether they really saw it or whether they're being nice. Some people, my wife, Stephanie, who I didn't know at the time, she thought it was great. She and her family watched it. But it was, definitely, like I said, because it was on Showtime, it was pretty hard to see.
Right. Was there ever a consideration of you going on to the Larry Sanders Show?
He called us at one point when he was developing it. He said, would you guys be interested in developing pilot with me, and we either were running The Simpsons or we had just created The Critic and were tied to that. So for whatever reason, it wasn't because we didn't want to do it, but we turned it down. But I would say once I got on The Simpsons, I just said I want to be on The Simpsons as long as there is a Simpsons, basically. I mean, we left a little bit, even though we kept consulting and doing episodes. But The Simpsons is the ideal TV job. It couldn't be better.
So let's move into The Simpsons
Okay.
and talk about that. So you talked a little bit about how you started working on the show, but at what point in the development of the series did you guys get involved?
Well, Matt Groening had done, I think, about 50 or so short segments for the Tracy Ullman Show. And in those short segments, they already had Dan Castellaneta, Nancy Cartwright, Yardley Smith, and Julie Kavner. He'd already created the characters of Grandpa, Itchy and Scratchy, and Krusty, as well as the family and Maggie. You know, so it was... that was what they sent us when they said, do you want to take this job? And I thought those shorts were really funny. And the animation style was cool. And Sam had been hired because he had experience running, you know, Taxi and knew how to do a half-hour show. He was hired to run the show, to turn these shorts into a, you know, half-hour series. So we came in and met with them, and they said, well, here's some different episodes you could do. And one was Bart the Genius, and one was the first one we wrote, which was where the family goes into electroshock therapy and they're always shocking each other. And that went well. We got asked to write another, which was Jim wanted to do one where Lisa was sad, and it became the episode Moaning Lisa. And we were also punching up the first 8 that they did. And we had to go back for the 4th year of the Shandling Show, which was kind of ironic because when we were at Shandling, then The Simpsons came on the air, and suddenly we were simultaneously working on the number 2 show and the number 100 show at once. And, like, you certainly get a kind of a cocky feeling sitting around where you're going, my other show is number 2, and I can go back there in about 4 months. So we were very happy.
So what was the animation style of The Simpsons like, and how did it differ from the other animated shows that had come before it?
Well, first and foremost, it's based on Matt's cartooning style, which was in Life in Hell. And it's a really ingenious style to me because it's incredibly distinctive. You immediately spot it whenever you see it. But I believe it's also very simple in a good way where, you know, even my 8-year-old can draw Bart. You can say, this is what she drew, and someone would say, hey, it's Bart Simpson. And the original animation studio, Klasky Csupo, was, I don't know if it was underground is the right word, but they weren't known for glossy, say, Disney-type animation. It was a much rougher look. Faces would twist, and there was an animator, Georgie Pelusi, who said, make them yellow, and also wanted to make, like, the trees purple, and, you know, it was definitely going to be different. And, like, the yellow thing was a completely inspired idea. So, you know, it was funny because people would go, oh, it's so ugly. The animation is so ugly. And I would go, well, it's actually really cool and catches your eye, which to me is the opposite of ugly. And the characters were really compelling, and the way that the animation showed their acting was really compelling. So I thought from the beginning the animation was terrific. And people forget, well, first of all, they used to say you couldn't do animation on television. It's not economically feasible. And Hanna-Barbera, you know, experimented with recycling scenes and limiting poses, and that's how they started the process. You know, The Simpsons, the fact that we were putting on a show every week was, like, amazing. And you know, initially, people forget this, there was this uproar because we had too few episodes. We had 13, and they didn't order more till late in that run. So they had to run the same 13 over and over again, and people kept waiting for the new season to start.
Right. Were you involved personally in any of the animation decisions in the beginning?
Well, you want me to wait for the car horn to stop?
Stop.
Oh, okay. The animation design was mainly done by Matt and by Sam Simon. As I got to run the show in seasons 3 and 4, I got more and more involved with it. And you would, you know, discuss with the I'd start getting the storyboards, and you would give extensive notes on the boards. Mostly, about how we thought a joke should be staged. Mostly the biggest note at the beginning. Some directors like David Silverman and Rich Moore, just brilliant, great from the start. Some, and you'd have to give notes on the boards where you would say, make sure this isn't, Saturday morning style cartoon acting. Make sure that, these characters look like real humans. It's okay if the movements are limited, if they're believable. And, we learned things like don't make crowds too big because you can't make that look convincing. But it's an ongoing process. We still give these notes and we still have these issues, 25 years in. And we've had, with The Simpsons, several big changes. There's people say, oh, you changed it completely from season 1 to 8. There was really a big change from 1 to 2 where some backgrounds that looked like cartoony backgrounds where it would just be a flat 2D, drawing were fleshed out, more items added. So by like the start of the second season, it looked different. Then after the 13th season, we went from hand painting to digital animation, digital coloring, because nobody basically was doing hand painting anymore. We went to high def several years ago. That was a big switch, sort of the precursor being the Simpsons movie.
And going back to that very beginning, how do you turn the shorts into a series? I mean, what did you take from the Tracy Ullman shorts and bring into the show?
Well, there was things that were undefined. Like in the shorts, if you look at them, Bart and Lisa are both Hellraisers, and there's little distinction between the characters. So one thing was to make Lisa different from Bart, and that's why we wanted to do that, first Lisa episode where she's actually intellectual, and it was a character I certainly related to more than I did Bart, and that wasn't my idea, but that she had the saxophone. It was fleshing out these characters, and there it was Sam and Jim, making it into a show like Jim's other shows, like a Taxi or a Mary Tyler Moore.
Right. And considering that, obviously Matt had a cartoon background, but no one on the show really had an animation background.
Well, not on the writing staff.
Exactly.
Sam had worked on the Cosby cartoon show, which was a good show, and I think that was one reason that he was asked to run The Simpsons. But yeah, it was the writers tended to come from places like David Letterman or Saturday Night Live or Shandling Show. Again, not traditional sitcoms, but not animation.
And how did you learn to translate the written word into? Basically, how did you learn to describe to the animation team what you wanted them to create? It's not as simple as setting up the
biggest
camera.
lesson was just saying these should be realistic, even though they don't look like real people. And, the main way of conveying what you thought to them was notes on the storyboards. Then there would be a process called the animatic, where you would have about 1/10 of every, piece of animation that you would... It was like a run-through that you'd have for a normal sitcom, and you would show people the way that the show was trending, and you'd rewrite that. And one thing that Mike and I did running the show in seasons 3 and 4, we really boosted the rewriting done at the animatic level, where we would just go over the script like enormously. Again, because we were afraid of like letting anything go by, not be like as good as it could be. And then it was, just mostly continuing to repeat, you got to believe these people, you got to believe these characters.
Right. Talk a little bit about the town of Springfield. Was that based on any particular town?
Well, when Matt grew up, there was a show, Father Knows Best, which was set in Springfield, and he grew up in Oregon. He thought it was great because he thought that was Springfield, Oregon, that it was set in. So when he grew older, he realized, oh no, this is just a generic name, but he thought it would be a good name. I don't know if it's the most common city name in America, but it's pretty common. There's something like 47 Springfields in the United States. And so that was the idea. It was this any town. And that, the way we've written it, I'll give you a secret. It's nowhere in particular. It's by the ocean, but it's in a desert, but it's on a mountain, but it's, it's got every possible quality you could imagine.
Did you bring anything from any of your own personal experiences to
Oh,
the
yeah,
town?
everybody does. We would bring things from my personal life. I mentioned my sister when she said grace. That was one thing we had Bart doing. one thing Homer did is I had a sub sandwich for a party that we didn't eat, so I put it in the fridge and I kept eating pieces of it every day, tempting fate. And of course, Homer got very sick. I didn't go that far, but you know, you just think of things that happen to you or to your kids or to your friends or their kids. I mean, with a show that's done over 500 episodes, everything gets sucked in at some point. It's like a black hole, a funny black hole.
Definitely. What was the tone that you guys were trying to set with the humor on the show? Were you trying to make it like a traditional sitcom? Were you intentionally trying to make it edgy?
I think that. Like the essence of the tone of the show, this was a joke Sam did, was Bart saying that some bad kids wanted him to do something to be popular. And Homer calls him in and says, you know, you're not going to kill anybody, are you? And Bart goes, no. And he goes, are you? And then Homer goes, son, being popular is the most important thing in the world. And, you know, that really is the essence, is Homer is wrong. And you know, the show relies on the intelligence of the viewer and no laugh track to realize how funny it is for a father to say something like that.
Right. So the first episode that aired wasn't actually the first episode that
the first episode
air, right?
that was recorded was Some Enchanted Evening. And what happened was, this is chronicled in the DVD commentaries for the episode, but the director of that episode, who I won't name, but people can find out, worked on other shows that did not have the sort of same sensibility as The Simpsons. And from what I've heard, he thought he was funnier than the writers of the show. So he put in things that were scatological jokes, like flaming or smelly turds and things like that in the backgrounds. And that first show, as it came back, was unairable, and it was a near disaster. It nearly destroyed this whole thing that turned into a 25-year show. And there was a meeting I wasn't at where one of the producers said, this is shit. And then one of the animators said, well, what do you mean by shit? And he goes, shit, a foul-smelling substance makes people sick or something. So it was really, really, you know, in hindsight, it's one of the few things I wasn't at that I wish I had been at, but I wasn't there. And it was a bit like a channeling. And then the next week, David Silverman's Bart the Genius came back, which was great. And so the decision was made, we better retool this first one. And the first show I wrote was also directed by that guy, and it wasn't as far along, so they could fix it faster. But they pulled him off of it. And they said, we'll premiere at Christmas instead of in the fall. And so what became the premiere was the Christmas episode, which was written by Mimi Pond, although the staff, which was Jim and Matt and Sam and Mike recently, did a big rewrite on it.
Was that common to do rewriting on the scripts?
On The Simpsons, I always say any writer who's got his name or her name on the show is at most 30% of the show, you know, the jokes they've written, you know, if they're really good and lucky. And many shows are just completely changed. We do 8, 9, 10 revisions before it gets to the cast even, and then more as we go to animatic, and more yet as it comes back from color. One thing I've mentioned more than once is that we did a joke about the Soviet Union early on, and by the time the show came back, the Soviet Union had broken it up, so we had to change it.
And is that because you guys want to maintain a really specific tone to the show that there's so much rewriting done?
Well, what happens is, and I think this is one reason the show is at a sustained level of quality, it's hard to get perspective on what you write, but when you see it at 2 or 3 month intervals, things that seem really funny, say on a live show, there's a thing, you know, you might think is really funny when you tape it, and then 2 weeks later it's not so funny, but we would catch those things and change them. So, you know, by the time something aired, any joke that stayed in the show had really gone through many, many gauntlets of approval.
That's interesting. And you also were, oh, you know what? We're actually going to stop and change tapes.
Great.